Today is the 22nd of November 2014. My name is Norbert Mein and I'm here to talk to the composer Alexander Goehr. Could you please start by telling us about when and where you were born?
I was born in 1932 in Berlin, August 1932, and at that time my father had already been offered a job for the gramophone company, what became EMI later on, in London, and my parents left as soon after my birth as was possible and came to London to find a flat or something. And I stayed with my grandparents, and they brought me to England in the beginning of 1933, I believe, as far as we have no records, but I suppose it must have been around about then, very quickly. So my entire life in Germany spanned 3 months. So I didn't form any strong impressions.
Could you say a few words about your mother?
My mother was Russian. She came from Kiev at that time. That was considered to be Russian. And she and her parents had left Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution, about 1922. And my mother had been educated in Berlin and then went to the Hochschule, where she was a pianist, and a good one, I think. And she studied under a very distinguished teacher there, Leonid Kreutzer. And she then, when she graduated, she became professionally active, first of all in the silent cinema, playing in the orchestra. She did that for some time, and then she and another friend formed a duo, and at that time in the 1920s it was customary or fashionable to take English names, so they called themselves the Stone Sisters. So they were neither sisters nor stones, but that's what they called themselves, and they were extremely successful playing. Well, they would have called it jazz, but it wasn't jazz, it was ragtime, also ragtime-inspired light music with vocals. And they were both pretty girls, and they were engaged all over the place, and they went on until, as was customary at that time, my mother gave up her profession when she got married. And of course, the one tiny detail, which of course I'm incredibly proud of, is that my parents were introduced at a party of Billy Wilder's in Berlin, Billy Wilder, as he was known there. So I consider myself a distant product of Billy Wilder, not as good as the other products of Billy Wilder's, but good nevertheless.
What was your father's work and development in Germany?
Well, my father was a pupil of Schoenberg and was in that Schoenberg class together with Roberto Gerard and Rufer. There's a picture in the other house of all of them, and Skalkotas and others. And he was a composer, and he wrote a number of pieces. And he, as a composer, he had, even before he'd studied with Schoenberg, he'd been a conductor in operetta. He learned that way. Unlike me, he was a very good all-round natural musician. He played very well, very good pianist, and
Did he come from a musical background himself?
No,
and how did he get into it?
The only music in our family came from his mother, who died before I was born, so I didn't know her, called Tekla Mendelssohn, of the eminent Mendelssohn family. And so the architect was her cousin, and so on, and we knew the families. And that was the only music before that. But my grandfather was a businessman, and they were sort of middle-class, secular Jews with absolutely no interest in the subject of Judaism. And my parents were 1920s people, with all that that implies, you know. They lived a wild life, so that my father, when he finished his studies with Schoenberg, veered more towards Hindemith and Kurt Weill. And he did a lot of music of that kind. In fact, he wrote the first radio opera. He worked for Berlin Radio, which was well ahead of its time, and which actually will come up again because it contributes one thing which he contributed in England very much, to the BBC and that sort of thing. And he did that, and then he was an all-round musician, writing incidental music, and he wrote a piece for Donaueschingen after the Little Mahagoni by Brecht and Weill. He wrote the second piece with Feuchtwanger for Donaueschingen called Pep. And he also was the music director for Piscator in Berlin at the theatre. So he did theatre music, and he moved in sort of moderately left-wing circles. He was closely friendly with Eisler. And there's a song of his in the Spanish songbook. But how politically he actually was, I don't know, not terribly. Just generally, in principle.
So there was a practical side to his very practical side to his musical activity in Berlin, and then there was the influence of Schoenberg. At that time, what do you think was the influence of Schoenberg on him as a musician?
Well, anyone who had to do with Schoenberg, he thought that Schoenberg was the greatest, as we think, I think. However, he didn't think that everybody who came under that influence and was able to live with it, he sort of thought it. I think he wouldn't have said this, but I would have gathered from him that he thought that only the elite were up to it. And when Schoenberg, when the 12-tone technique was invented, and so he said, well, only people who are really rather good should do this, because you know it's not so easy to make good music with it. And he was faithful to Schoenberg all the time, and he conducted a great deal of Schoenberg in London, well, all of it. So as far as anyone conducted it. But he had a kind of reserve. His natural musical taste would have veered more towards Ravel.
So why do you think was the offer of a job in London so attractive to your father?
Well, why do you think? I mean, in 1932, the things weren't so happy in Germany, and it was, you know, it was a great way to get out of it. And the job in London was a very good one. He was called musical director at what later was the Gramophone Company, which meant that he not only conducted most of the records, but he also looked after the library. You know, they did everything. It was a small concern, and you know, it was a good job. And I suppose, from the English point of view, England didn't at that time have that kind of all-round musician. It wouldn't have been common, hard to find here. And that's why they went and found someone in Berlin, because they had this wide experience and could do all kinds of music, from jazz, what they call jazz, upwards and downwards.
So he was headhunted?
He was headhunted. And so he came and he settled in London, and here I am. Yeah.
So could you talk us through the first few years in London for the young family?
Well, well, the Young family wasn't interesting. The Young family went to school. But what my father did is he did what are these marvelous, now historical records. Some of them are on the internet. I mean, the first recording of the Bizet Symphony, assisting Stravinsky on the first recording of Les Noces, accompanying Caruso and Gili and John McCormack and the singers of that time, all those records. Very often it says John McCormack or Beniamino Gili, but it doesn't mention the conductor because it was just a chap who did the accompaniment. But he did all that, and he hundreds of records, and he was much, obviously well regarded because he also recorded symphony. For instance, in that time, the best recording of the Tchaikovsky concerto was regarded as Horowitz, Toscanini, but the second recording was Egon Petri and my father. And my father's recording with Mojsevich, who is someone who you ought to pay attention to as well. He was a great pianist who lived in Berkhamsted, where I went to school. Mojsevich recorded the Rachmaninoff concerto with my father, and even recently on these sort of BBC historic performances on record, they say it's a better performance than Rachmaninoff's own. And so he did quite, it was quite something. And then he did something else, which is worth mentioning here. He started an orchestra called the Orchestra Raymond. And it performed once a week, I think, on BBC Home Service, half-an-hour concerts, and it consisted of the great players of the time, Reg Kell, the flute player who went to Hollywood, Cleghorn, and all the greatest London players. And my father arranged all the music for them because this is a thing which I'm proudest of on his behalf and has to do with your subject, the emigration. He knew from Radio Berlin how one wrote through, because of Stravinsky, Hindemith, Schoenberg, Bartók, he knew how to use 10 instruments, 15 instruments and make a good sound, and nobody in England knew how to do that. And our garage in Amersham where we lived was full of his arrangements, which went from at one end Duke Ellington to the other end Mussorgsky, Stravinsky, and he arranged all these pieces every week, and as a result of that work he got his war work because he was the musician of the propaganda. And propaganda in 1939 had to be quick because they did a program called Marching On every Wednesday after the news. And then they did propaganda for the occupied countries of Europe. So he was working 3 times a week, and you had to do the music. Now, this whole venture of the propaganda, which is one I'm find very interesting, and I'm surprising there isn't more literature about it, was run by a man called Lawrence Gilliam, who was a sort of genius at the BBC, who invented what was called the feature, then much imitated in other Germany as well. Ingeborg Bachmann wrote features for the German radio. The idea was to make an opera of the news. The news generally bad and then a little better as the war progressed, employed the voices of soldiers in the fields, reporters, and the news had been broadcast. There was the 9 o'clock news at that time, and at 9:30 came this program, and it was a kind of dramatization to make people understand what was actually happening in the war, from a sort of more human point of view. And so there was a lot of music, folk music, art music, and they had to have someone you know, the films at that time in England were for orchestras of 50. You couldn't do it, and there was technically no way of doing it. So the BBC employed my father on a permanent basis because of the Orchestre Raymond, because he had this ability to arrange for 10 instruments, which is Hindemith, Stravinsky, as I said, and that's a little contribution that the émigré made to English music, because now, of course, the Sinfonietta and the Birmingham Ensemble, every orchestra in the world, everyone writes for 12 instruments. But that was new at that time.
That's a very, very nice example of a sort of real transfer of skill and of practical things.
Yes, yes, and it had an enormous effect, because at the same time during the war my father gave concerts. He spent some of the money earned on what was the Walter Gurr Orchestra in the Wigmore Hall. Believe it, on the stage of the Wigmore Hall there was an orchestra, and of course in those concerts he did what he wanted. I think Maria Littke was the leader of that orchestra, and he gathered his very good musicians, Dennis Brain and others. First performance with Britten Serenade, Tippett, Schoenberg Chamber Symphony in England, all sorts of, they were very interesting concerts, perhaps a dozen of them in all he gave over the years, and he paid for them himself, I think. That was great, you know. And I, as a small boy, lived in the Wigmore Hall when I was not at school, and listened to these concerts. And that's why I still love the Wigmore Hall, and I'm very grateful if they put on one of my pieces there, because I feel at home there, as I do at the BBC.
So at the beginning of the war, your father was actually quite a established and powerful man in music in London.
I don't think he would have liked the word powerful very much. Power is... He was well established, yes. And of course, unlike many of the real refugees who came in 36, 37, 38, we were naturalized in 1941. Very few people were. But because of his war work, he and my mother and I were naturalized. So there's no Isle of Man or Canada or Australia or for us.
I'm wondering, since he was very active and he could bring in other musicians, if he was approached by other émigré musicians who arrived in London, if he brought them into the system. There were difficulties, I understand, with getting work permits for musicians then.
I don't know about how that worked. I mean, I know that in the BBC Times he used everyone he could who wasn't in the army to do this work. I mean, he couldn't do it all single-handed, and all the Scheibers and Reitzensteins and the others all worked for him, orchestrating, and you know, because they all worked there. I mean, now whether they had work permits or not, I haven't the least idea. I mean, I was only...
Well, that's probably not so important then.
I was only 10 at the time, so they didn't tell me. But you know, I know that he felt that a lot of the English composers weren't qualified to do the work because they didn't know how to deal with these small ensembles and weren't technically of that kind. But I think a lot of the people worked for him for the propaganda.
Could you tell us then how your father got involved with Morley College?
Well, Morley College is a very remarkable institution, as you know, and not really the subject matter of these discussions, except that Michael Tippett, who was very close to my father at that time, he almost lived in our house for a long time. He came very regularly. And my father and he collaborated, especially on his opera The Midsummer Marriage, which my father helped him a lot with, and orchestrated. You can hear some of my father's typical orchestrations if you hear that opera. If you happen to know it, doesn't make it a better or worse opera, but anyway, that's how it was. But Michael Tippett had succeeded Gustav Holst as the musical director of Morley, so that my father Tippett took my father there, and Matja Scheiber also taught there, and it was a very good place. It was then bombed. I mean, it was good for more than music, but my father gave concerts with the Morley College Choir, and there was a lot going on there. It was a very good thing, and Tippett did a great job there, and Tippett was my first hero, as it were, because I learned from him a great deal, because he was in our house and imitated him, and also listening to him trying to explain to my father what T.S. Eliot's Wasteland was about, which my father found not easy, but Tippett liked to explain such things. He was a great friend of Eliot's, and so
there was quite a varied musical activity going on with, first of all, I mean the skill of arranging for the small chamber performances at the BBC, and then collaborating with Tippett and really pushing contemporary music further with his own heritage of Schönberg. But then there was also an interest in early music that developed in Morley College.
Well, that was the Monteverdi business. Again, one of your emigres, Hans Redlich, who lived near here in Letchworth, actually, but he later on became professor of music in Manchester. But Redlich was from Vienna, and Redlich had put together, I believe is the correct term, the Vespers of 1610. And my father had got interested in this. My father was an all-rounder. He wasn't an old music person, and of course Monteverdi was known until 1944 or 43 only through Anthony Lewis. There was a performance of Popper in Oxford, but God knows what it was like, and there was the records by Nadia Boulanger from the 30s. But well, it's a different subject, but my father actually got very fascinated by Monteverdi, and Redlich obviously was the originator of this. And the Vespers, which in the Malipiero edition, which is what they had at that time, they're separate pieces, but they got the idea that there was a Vespers. Later this was questioned. On the other hand, through my father's good work, the Vespers has now become like the B minor Mass or something. It is part of the choral repertoire. And my father, in the last years of the war, and the immediate post-war period, managed to put on performances of the Vespers with Morley College Choir. I remember being taken from Berkhamsted to the first performance of the Vespers in Central Hall, Westminster, probably. Either that or a theatre. The two teachers took me down, and so I attended. And together with August Wenzinger in Basel, this was the beginning of Monteverdi. I mean, before that, no one actually had any idea. And everything arises from that. My father managed to interest Tippett, and who wrote a prelude for Monteverdi too, and they edited a lot of old music. This is Walter Bergman at Schotts. They edited, but mainly sort of Purcell and Orlando Gibbons and things. My father was also involved in that, and he ultimately, Redlich, who was obviously a very considerable scholar, but tended not he tended to make mistakes. And after my father had found something like 3,000 mistakes in the Vespers, after he'd done a number of performances, he decided to make his own version, and he actually went in the 50s to Venice to consult the manuscripts of these pieces, and although he was never a trained musicologist, he actually spotted a lot about the notation, which is very complex, about black notation and white notation, which I'm not competent to discuss, nor is it necessary. But he became a Monteverdi person, and then he performed the Monteverdi every 3 years at the York Festival, which was part of the Festival of Britain, where it was also performed. And he did that there. Hans Hess, who was the director of the York Festival, who was a great friend of ours and a remarkable man, and actually an art historian, but he ran this festival. And so my father did it very frequently with the Sheffield Choral Union and the Philharmonia. And of course, that's where John Eliot Gardner heard it first, and that's how he got his enthusiasm for it. It was from my father's performance, and in many ways, his manner of doing Monteverdi, it's gone a long way further, but it's the same idea. And of course, the other interesting person involved in that, from Basel, okay, this is not really about emigres, but it's of interest to you because you're a singer. Wenzinger had a tenor who invented the style in which Monteverdi is sung. His name was Max Miley. And Max Miley came to London for my father's performances, and he taught all the Janet Bakers and Heather Harpers and other singers how to sing Monteverdi. And he had invented this from a mixture of pictures, old texts, surmises, and the style in which you hear Monteverdi now is actually an invention, because before that they sung it like Puccini or Respighi or something, and they had no idea. Now, whether it's right or wrong, wouldn't be qualified to judge, but nevertheless, the style you hear in every opera house in the world, every concert of Monteverdi singing, comes from Max Miley, I believe.
So we're talking about the cradle, the origins of the now incredibly vibrant and multi-million pound early music business in this country.
Well, don't call it a business, it's an art.
Yes, you're right. I also think a scene is also, but there is a stronghold of appreciation and of expertise.
Yes.
And it has gone a very long way, and Britain has been recognized all over the world as a place that can really do this.
Yes, as good as Holland. I mean, but it was the Goldsborough Orchestra, which became the English Chamber Orchestra. Britten himself and Peter Pears, all these people were involved in this.
There was Alfred Deller.
Alfred was involved in this. I knew Alfred very well, and his consort. Alfred was regarded as a curiosity when he appeared, and before anyone could say anything to Alfred, he always brought from his pocket a picture of his wife and children in case anyone got the wrong idea of who he was. He was a very good artist. You can still.
There are still recordings of him, and then there's
they're all on
films
the internet
as well. Exactly, it's
sure.
Wonderful.
No, he worked with my father on Tippett all the time, and he was in the Vespers.
And there was Walter Bergmann. You already mentioned him once, who cultivated the recorder as a, and he was also a continuo player. Sort
of, yes. I don't know the greatest, but he was, yes. Yeah. He was more, his importance in musical life was as a publisher. He started at Schatz, my publisher, he started the whole idea of recorder music, which became well, they produced some rather dubious instruments, which went round all the schools. They were characterized, my father always said, by being out of tune at all times. You know, there was no point at which they were in tune. And they were always out of tune, and the players always smiled. They played out of tune. But he nevertheless created a big thing, because it became a prime educational thing, which was then added to which was also shot to the Orff instruments, which were rather better quality.
Yes, and Walter Bergmann's recorder class at Morley did perform in the Monteverdi Vespers.
Yes.
You know, so they had some use.
Moderate.
Now, you mentioned Walter Bergmann, about somebody who published and edited a lot of music. And of course, many emigres were in the publishing industry before they emigrated to Britain. I mean, we're talking about Universal Edition and great Viennese, the great Viennese tradition of publishing. Now, could you just give us a picture of how they established themselves in Britain?
Well, there are two publishers involved, really. One is Boosey and Hawkes, and the other one was Peters. Schatz was not involved with this at all. And Boosey, there was probably also Novello's Dr. Arba, his name was. He was probably an emigre too. A lot of publishers had come from Vienna, but of course the most interesting was the trio from the UEA, from the Universal Edition from Vienna, which of course was a Jewish firm and was taken over when Austria was occupied by Peters, not by Hinrichsen. Hinrichsen was in Peters here, the Jewish Hinrichsen, but by Peters from Leipzig. Leipzig, isn't it? Yeah. And Dr. Kalmus, who was the son-in-law of Herzka, the founder of the Universal Edition, which is the most important publisher of music of the early 20th century, and great publisher, and Erwin Stein, who was Schoenberg's assistant in Vienna and worked for the UE, and Dr. Roth, who I don't know. I didn't know him personally, so I can't talk about him, but he was the sort of managing director, I think, Ernst Roth. And I knew Dr. Kalmus very well, because he was very close to my father, and I almost grew up under their influence and knew them very well. And I knew Erwin Stein, who worked there. And they had this thing called the Anglo-Soviet, which was a part of the Boosey and Hawkes, and they published the Russian music, Prokofiev and Shostakovich. They all were published there. And they worked there, and then the story, which I'm sure is recorded elsewhere, but which you ought to have, is what happened in 1944, when the war was drawing to the end. The shares of the Universal Edition had become worthless, because, you know, it had been taken over by the Germans, and the people in Vienna had hidden the Jewish works, Erwin Ratz particularly, whose family was a bakery, and they'd hidden all the Jewish works, Schoenberg and whatever, in flour sacks, so that these works could survive and not be caught. And at the end of the war, Dr. Kalmus toured the world, buying up or getting hold of these worthless shares until he had a majority, and then he fought in the courts to get the Universal Edition back, which he did. And he then reinstated it, and he was a remarkable man. I mean, he knew what he was doing. They were very good publishers, and remained until comparatively recently a very important publisher. And Bouzys similarly had this strong influence from Erwin Stein and Kalmus and so on, Dr. Roth. So they played an important role in music publishing. There is more to it, Peters and Novello, as I said, but I know less about them because I never came across them, so I can't tell you anything. Others would be able to tell you that.
Now, can we talk about some other colleagues of your father and influential emigres we've already mentioned? Let's start perhaps with Roberto Gerhard.
Roberto Gerhard, as he was known in England, but Gerhard really, was brought to Cambridge because at the time of the Spanish Civil War, and Professor Dent, my esteemed predecessor in my job, managed to arrange with Professor Trend, the professor of Spanish, a fellowship at King's. And so he came, and a wealthy and benevolent lady called Alice Roughton supported him and gave him a house where he lived until his death. And he worked, he was a pupil of Schoenberg's. He was probably the most distinguished composer among the emigres. At least everyone will have their own estimation of this, but in my estimation I would have thought he was probably the most remarkable one. He lived in Cambridge. He never participated in teaching here. He didn't teach anybody. He never wanted to teach. When I approached him to do something for the SPNM, which is a subject which will come up, he declined, didn't want to do anything. And he had a certain amount of influence. He earned his living as far as he could and did where there weren't any commissions, or if they were so poorly paid that it wouldn't have mattered. But with incidental music, the way composers worked, I was still, when I began, I earned my living that way. You wrote music for BBC features and dramas, and this was a very good way. It wasn't paid by present-day standards very royally, but nevertheless, you could make a living, and you could use a group of instruments, and you could choose it. And you know, they were very interesting things. Britain, you know, Under Milkwood was a BBC thing. My father did many of them. Britain did The Rescue with Eddie Sackville West, and people like Gerhard, that's Scheiber and people, made a certain amount of money that way, and you know, when recording came in, that really prospered. I was probably the last generation to do that sort of work, and I learned a lot from doing it, working with playwrights and poets and things. There were a lot of poets around, and of course, one of my childhood memories, we didn't mention this in relation to my father. Every year, the Queen talked on Christmas Day at 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock or something. And before that, before she talked, there was a tour of the world of the British troops here and whatever, wherever they were, and lighthouse keepers and things, and they toured the world to wish everybody a happy Christmas. And the narrator was always a famous actor, was Olivier or Richardson, one of the great Gielgud, one of the great actors. And my father did this every year. This was one of his jobs, because Lawrence Gilliam produced it. He was the great producer there, as I said before. And then there was a lunch. The BBC gave a lunch, and we used to stay in London at that hotel near Maida Vale Studios, where there's a plaque where Freud stayed when he arrived in England. And it was a sort of, I suppose, a black marketplace, because there was tasty chickens and things, and we always stayed there over Christmas because there were no babysitters and we lived in the country. And so one of my most important early experiences were the parties that followed this broadcast, because they always consisted of all the great Louis MacNeice, Dylan Thomas, you know, all the great actors and poets came to these parties. I mean, I wasn't an active participant, I hasten to add. I sat in the corner because there were no babysitters, but it was sort of in my book of essays, which was published, it's called Finding the Key. And I feel a great deal of my education was looking through keyholes or overhearing conversations that weren't aimed at me. You know, and this is one of them.
So Roberto Gerhardt...
Roberto, my father quarreled with him rather early. Roberto then was picked up by Lord Harwood, who was a student here, and by William Glock. And so he got performed more and commissioned more, and you know, his works exist. They're neglected now, and unjustly so. A lot of them very good, especially the works he wrote before he came here, the Spanish ones. But the opera, the Duenna, is quite something. I mean, it's better than a lot of operas that do get performed.
And another person who wrote for BBC was Matthias Scheiber.
Yeah. Matthias Scheiber was a Hungarian, and he lived in Frankfurt before the war, and he was, I believe, a pupil of Kodály, probably. And he had a big influence, more than Roberto, because so many of the English composers were his pupils. He taught in a sort of Hungarian Bartóki, mixed with Schoenberg. It was a way of teaching which was very much based on Bach inventions, and that's very much Bartók. And at that time, Fricker was a pupil of his, now forgotten, probably unjustly, justly, I don't know. Fricker, Hugh Wood was a pupil of his, Anthony Gilbert, who was a pupil of mine later on. He had many pupils, and he was an important influence and a very good composer. I mean, I still reckon that his oratorio, based on James Joyce, Ulysses, is an excellent piece and ought to be performed, very well written for choir, somewhat influenced by Tippett's Child of Our Time, but good. And he unfortunately died very young. He was killed in a car crash in South Africa, and his life was cut short in his 50s or something. But he had an important influence, although characteristically your organization or the academy did not see fit to give him a composition class. He taught at home or at Morley College, as was the case of many of the composers who couldn't get jobs in colleges. I suppose they still can't.
What about Leopold Spinner?
Leopold Spinner, if Scheiber had a big influence, one could safely say that Leopold Spinner had no influence. Leopold Spinner, who I think, as far as I know his work, was a very good composer, very much believing that Anton Webern had formed a new musical language in which you could express yourself freely. And Spinner, who at the end of his life went back to Vienna, worked in all his working life at Bozy's for Erwin Stein. He was a great friend of Stravinsky's because he made all the piano scores for Stravinsky. He was an extremely secretive and private man, one felt appropriately in the tradition of Webern. And there was in Ealing a pianist, Elsa Cross, who I also had she played some of my pieces. Her husband had been my father's solicitor and Webern's in Vienna, and this was a sort of little clique. And of course their pet hate was another composer who we haven't mentioned, was Karl Rankel, who was very important. He's another Schoenberg pupil, who became the first conductor at Covent Garden after the war.
And we performed some of his vocal music actually at the Royal College.
Not recently. A bad composer. I mean, you know, and he wrote an opera, didn't he? Which was, I can't remember. Was it on J.M. Singh? Was it Deirdre of the Sorrows?
I think so. Yes.
I think so.
And he was very influential at Covent Garden,
he
building
a
sort of, I think it's the first opera company in Britain that was formed to work all year round.
Permanent, yeah, that's right, it was. And he was the first director, music director there, so that is an important thing to have done. He left England afterwards and went to live in Switzerland later on. But he was an émigré, and he was one of Schoenberg's, in the original Schoenberg class.
And he was also a friend of Hans Eisler.
He was a co-student of Hans Eisler. He was with Hans Eisler in Schoenberg's class at exactly the same time, with Berg.
Can we talk about Eisler a little bit more?
Well, Eisler doesn't fit in really. I can tell you, I can go on for hours about Eisler, but Eisler was never in England.
For a short transitional period, but he was only traveling.
He basically was in other places and ended up in America and then back to the DDR. But Eisler's influence in England did exist on Tippett, and of course if we talk of Eisler, we have to talk about the communists. And there were a number of those who later went back to the GDR. Ernst Hermann Mayer, who was a pupil of Eisler's, I believe, and a colleague of Alan Bush, and did a lot of work for the Workers' Music Association, and he was a musicologist as well, and he wrote a book which is still to be found in the library. It's called English Chamber Music, which is about early music. Do you know the book?
I know, yes.
Yeah. And he worked here. There was a library in Cambridge by Paul Hirsch, which my father used to visit, and I think there was a centre here which was around that. And Ernst Hermann Mayer was a communist. His daughter, who is someone you would do very well to interview, because she lives in Cambridge some of the time at least. And that was a sort of little grouping. They were Anglo-Austrian society people and various forms of left-wing organizations, and they trooped off to the DDR at the end of the war. I mean, there was a very good musicologist who later achieved prominence in East Germany and is now regarded, he published in England as well, called Knepler, Georg Knepler. Very good writer. You probably know from East Germany. Do you know the name?
The name rings a bell.
Yeah, no, he wrote a very good book on Mozart, which was published in English even. And this was a different grouping from the Scheibers and Gerards. They didn't overlap to any extent, but they were also an émigré group, and they were the kind of people, Anglo-Austrian society and the Workers' Music Association. And Eisler certainly had an influence. I mean, Alan Bush, who was a very good composer, I mean, seriously underrated. He was a sort of Stalinist, and like many Stalinists, he grew perhaps a little narrow-minded as he progressed. But for instance, his string quartet Dialectic is still the best piece for string quartet written by any English composer, I think. And he taught at the Academy, and he was a great teacher of traditional skills, as befits a Stalinist perhaps. And some of his works were really very good indeed. And he had a big influence. He and Eisler had a certain amount of influence on Tippett. Early Tippett was very left-wing. Later on he became a pacifist and so on, but he had in South London before Morley College time, there was a sort of quasi-Trotskyist grouping, and Eisler certainly can be heard in Tippett sometimes. But other than that, Eisler's visits here were to do with film music and nothing very serious. And he never, Brecht and Eisler came here in '36, I think, briefly, to do a version of Pagliacci for Anthony Asquith. But I don't think Eisler is really part of this story. I mean, you know, he was in America by this time, and that's a different story.
Yes, it is a different story. It's related in some ways since the transformations that went on in America, you know, they are on a different level, and a lot is connected with Hollywood, of course, but still there's also a lot of cultural transfer that happened there, and I think that's really the subject of the exchange of, or the export of professional musicianship in you know, that happened in this period is, you know, he is a very much a story of that.
Yes, well, I think I'm happy to say it on record or off record that, in my opinion, along with Britten, Eisler is the best songwriter of the middle of the 20th century. It's, I mean, I consider Britten songs magnificent, many of them, not everyone, but most of the cycles I think are very remarkable. And I think at his best, Eisler, of course, wrote hundreds of these songs, ranging from frankly embarrassing propaganda songs, which he would write in about 15 minutes dead, to settings of Hölderlin and particularly Brecht, of course, and the Hollywood elegies, which I think are a masterpiece of that time. They're beautiful songs. I'm happy to see that the great German singers now all do this. From Fischer-Dieskau onwards, they all sing Eisler. And this is good news. Eisler's influence, I don't know. You would have to ask one of the film composers more. That, of course, one of the people who we should have mentioned among the film composers, which, well, I'm going off the Eisler topic a bit, but one of the big things achieved in the émigré world was the founding of the SPNM. In the war. This is the most important organization.
That's the Society for the Promotion of New Music.
Society for the Prevention, or popularly called for the Prevention of New Music, but sometimes properly called for the Promotion of New Music. And this was formed by a film composer, pupil of Scheiber's later, but of Dukas originally in Paris, a Romanian, who went under the name Francis Chagrin, who ironically took the name Chagrin, which is a strange thing to do. He'd lived in Paris, and he'd been a pupil of Dukas. He was in the same class as Messiaen, in fact. And he came to London, and I think he studied with Matthias Scheiber later on, and they formed the idea that there should be a forum for modern music, and this was the SPNM, which became an organization of the greatest importance for the development of music in this country. And there is no composer of my generation who didn't hear his works for the first time at the SPNM.
So perhaps can we talk a bit more about the BBC? I mean, you worked there yourself.
I had a part-time job under William Glock, yes, and I worked with Hans Keller, who you're interested in, a very remarkable man, a great scholar, a great ham actor,
And football fan, I understand.
and a great football fan, and you know, he liked to show off, but 90% of him was really very original musical thinking. And of course, much of it's now been published by Christopher Wintle, and that's the Plumbago Press. And very interesting reading it makes too. Hans, in the BBC, he ran amok, you know. I mean, it was a time unlike the present, which was very favorable to his ideas, and his ideas ranged from, on the one hand, the promotion of new music of Schoenberg and post-Schoenbergian music, and the kind that isn't so popular right now. On the other hand, he was very concerned with the performance of classical chamber music, and possibly his most important work at the BBC was in the talks. He really, these were the last days of the third program, and when it became Radio 3, it was reorganized and so on. But in those days, it was still very much a consolidated program with one thing relating to another. And Hans, who had a tendency to go over the top, Private Eye had a go at him with his five-second news flashes and things. But for all the stuff that one might feel slightly embarrassed about, at his best, he was a remarkable musical scholar in a restricted area that he performed in, which ranged from, as I say, classical chamber music, Mozart and Haydn, and so. And he did very good work there and had a very important influence on everyone, I think. I certainly learned a great deal from him. I once went to have a lesson with him, but it was no good. I would have liked to have had somebody who was not a composer who pulled one's pieces to pieces, and that was hard to find. And I thought he might be the person, but he didn't do it.
Did you know Paul Hamburger, who also worked at the BBC?
Yes, of course. I knew all those sorts of people, and they were all, you know, they were marvelous musicians, but I can't tell you anything really of personal interest about them. They're just people I worked with. I mean, you know, Paul Hamburger, I was a producer, and Paul Hamburger would come in to play with a singer or an instrumentalist, and one would talk for a minute or two, but not much more. So I didn't really know them.
Would you, did you speak German as a child at home?
Yeah, I still speak German. Yeah.
Would you have spoken German with your colleagues there at the BBC, with Hans Keller? Or
Never.
You would just be British, and you would...
Well, I mean, it would never cross one's mind. Hans Keller spoke excellent English. I mean, all those people spoke English very well. Too well. I mean, that is an émigré subject in itself, about the English. I mean, Hans Keller's English was of a very particular nature. It wasn't native English, and it wasn't idiomatic English. but it was sort of constructed English, and it worked through a complex system of paradoxes and contradictions, which he liked very much. And he could go on for hours in a sort of sub Karl Kraus manner, working with different English phrases and turning them on their head. He just loved to do that. And he certainly, it wouldn't cross one's mind to speak German there.
And similarly, your father, I would think, did he professionally ever speak German, like?
Only with someone from Germany. I mean,
but there were quite a few around, but they became so British that they would just speak in English.
Well, I mean, that's where we were. I mean, you know, my father was very happy here. He liked England, and he was jolly grateful, as indeed was I, to be here. And he liked going to Germany very much. And in fact, at the end of his life, he died rather early, but at the end of his life, he was in some sort of negotiation with the Gewandhaus to have some sort of job there.
He would have considered going back and actually East Germany at that time. Then.
Well, he went to East Germany because Eisler introduced him, and he didn't like East Germany any less than he liked West Germany. I mean, they were just Germany for him. I mean, you know, he wasn't shocked. I mean, you would have much more complex feelings about the DDR, but as a visitor, he, you know, a lot of his friends were there. Ernst Busch, the actor, and a lot of people from the 20s and 30s who he'd worked with were there. In fact, I could have mentioned that, maybe it's not too late. In 1944, my grandfather, who had married for a second time because his first wife had died, had married a non-Jewish German, and who therefore was one of these Misch-Ehe people. And he survived in Berlin right through the war. And after the war, my father got a job writing up an account of what remained of cultural life in Berlin for the New Statesman. And they dressed him up as a colonel because you could only get into Germany in uniform in those times. So my father, who hadn't been in any war service in the army, managed to get himself dressed up in a uniform, which was a very comic sight to see. And he went to Berlin to look for his father, whom he found in good health and so on, living in the basement of his own house. He wrote reports on Berlin. So no, he always went back to Germany, and he worked in Hamburg and so on. He had no feeling. I mean, you know, we weren't racists, you know. So we just disliked certain people.
That's generous.
I mean, obviously, like all such family, we lost a lot of people in the camps, but that's how it was.
Your father's friend, Maria Litka, who was a professor at the Royal College of Music.
Yeah, I never thought of her that. She was a very good-looking violinist. Very beautiful she was, with a very deep voice, like, what's her name? Blue Angel.
Like Marlene Dietrich.
Like Marlene Dietrich, a very deep voice, and she was beautiful. And she led my father's orchestras at many points. And she changed her name to, she was actually called Lidke, but she was in the London Czech Trio, so she became a bit more Czech.
What do you think is the overall importance of that wave of emigre musicians who came to Britain for British music?
I don't think one should overstate it. There were no Stravinskys or Schoenbergs or Bartoks among the composers. they were good working composers, and they surely made a valuable contribution both in their pieces and as teachers and pedagogues. I don't like such assessments. You know, I feel for myself, as I would feel speaking on their behalf, that if one made a reasonable contribution to the institutions and one's societies, that's good enough. And I think I like the word contribution very much. Scientists use it. In our profession, there's a great deal of influence on prima donnas and ego trips and things. And we and musicians' sons don't go in for that. My father didn't approve of that kind of thing, and I was brought up to believe that those sort of star fuckers, or whatever they're called, ego trip people, were actually generally not what they were cracked up to be. And I live in a world, and have lived in a world, of working musicians of one kind or another, and we hope to have made a reasonable contribution. And so the émigrés, I'm sure I've given you some specific examples which occurred to me. The émigrés certainly, like in good bread, added a leavening of something which made the bread richer and better. They also learned a lot. I mean, many of the composers who came here were very much affected. It was a thing, especially after 45, but also, in fact, during the war, that people who came from Europe, who regarded as this the Land ohne Musik, you know, actually found a lot here, and it was a two-way thing. It wasn't as if the émigrés came by parachute and brought culture from the places where it mattered to the places where it didn't matter. It wasn't like that at all. It was an interpenetration, and the refugees, or the émigrés, however you call them, surely picked up, as we picked up the language and we picked up a literature. It's worked both ways, and I very much disliked it in the United States when one saw the parallel thing, the feeling, you know, that there were these great musicologists and great musicians, and they had brought these sort of savages, something they could sort of, sticks they could rub together and make a bit of a flame or something, you know, and I despised them there and thought that, you know, they were bloody lucky to have got the jobs they got. And I think, you know, I feel it for myself. You know, in one generation I became the head of a faculty in a traditional university, and it would have been unthinkable in any earlier time or in any other place. And had my father lived to see it, apart from his scornful jokes on the subject, he would have been amazed. And it was a two-way thing. And when I can answer your question more personally even. When I was a student in Paris, with Messiaen, with Boulez, friendly with Boulez and so on, and it was new music time, I seriously thought of remaining out of England and being a sort of European avant-gardist, and Darmstadt and all the rest of it, which I went to and I was sort of part of. And I felt, apart from the concentration of running out of money, that, you know, actually we didn't have anything to live on, that England, there I could be an avant-garde composer if I could make my living, and I could stay in France or Germany or Holland or wherever people can stay. If I came back to England, they could provide me with the life of a musician, but on certain conditions. I would have to write certain pieces in certain ways. I mean, you have to do yourself with choirs. If you are an avant-garde composer, my greatest disasters came from trying to write for large amateur choirs with the kind of technique that I had. And my God, and later on I reformed the Leeds choir myself to make it into the good choir it is now. I helped with that. But it was a two-way thing. England said, look, you can come here and we can provide you with a reasonable work. It's not the same as you'd get in another place, but we have our own things and we're not particularly ashamed of them. That's what we do. And if you wish to join in, join in. And if you don't wish to join in, then bugger off. And I decided, almost as a conscious decision, that I'd come back to England, and that's what I did, for better or worse. And it's the emphasis, the point of it is not about myself, but the emphasis that for the émigrés, and I suppose there wouldn't be one who would contradict it, it would be a two-way procedure. It didn't go. Obviously, one tells the stories about what was brought, but it was also something.
Of course, émigrés or refugees, they had to leave something behind, and there must be a sense of loss involved. But actually, in terms of musicians, it's also in what you've just said about the two-way thing. It's incredibly enriching as well as an experience.
Well, as you know, as a performer, music works in 3-hour sessions with a break in the middle, and that's what the life of a musician basically is. He either has or he does not have work today, and any sense of loss may be a supper conversation, but musicians aren't like that. Musicians work where people make music, and they don't really care a damn. I mean, it's very difficult to get, I mean, composers, no exception to that, but it's very difficult to get working musicians to take any interest in the world around them at all. And, you know, and if you just lift them up and put them somewhere else, they go on doing the same thing. And that may sound a bit cynical or skeptical, but I don't think so, because I think one has to recognize in all the people we've talked about, of course they have different personal feelings. I mean, you know, they also lose girlfriends from time to time, or boyfriends. But musicians have their own lives. It's like, I used to work in the theatre at one time, and I noticed when I worked in the theatre, you forgot about the world. The world became the theatre. And who knows who was killing who out there. It didn't concern you because you were working towards the performance. And that is a world. And we are very lucky as people to be of that world. I mean, if I had to have another go, I would hope to be a bit better than I am, but I wouldn't want to be in any other profession.
Finally, really, the thought about the relationship of a person with music as an art form. I always wondered if the experience of emigration and also the experience of the persecution, of the having been defined by, you know, being persecuted as well, if that would have made had an impact on the actual relationship with music as an art form and how it was cherished by that generation of musicians.
That's such a big question as to be almost unanswerable. You could say that these were individuals of exceptional deep understanding and commitment, and that there were others who flashed around Regent Street in smart suits who didn't have such deep feelings about these things, and they could be émigrés or locals or anything you want. So I don't think one should generalize, but then you raises you whether the effect of history, of what happened to the Germans, would have affected it. And there, of course, we could start again, because they're not necessarily. I know of people who used the opportunity of the emigration to change their professions, to do something completely different, something they'd always wanted to do and couldn't do in their own environment, so that it works that way too. And I don't think there's any real way to one could answer your question with a generalization. It's an individual matter. The people I knew probably all reacted in a slightly differing manner. I don't think overall they were any better or any worse, because I think they were mainly interested. I mean, if you're a tailor, you make suits, you know, and a musician makes music. And I suppose they mainly were interested to carry on and do in the new environment as best they could. Some of them very unhappily didn't manage, either because of their own bad luck, or as they say, or because of character, that they couldn't actually find out what the locals were trying to tell them. You know, there's certainly, I knew of such cases, I won't mention them, but it was a rich and varied thing, and it has no one character, I don't think. I mean, the great Amadeus Quartet, they liked to quarrel. If you went into the dressing room before they went on stage, you'd think they'd never talk to each other again. They were so awful. They were terrible. They screamed at each other. But then they played very well, and they went on until the end.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for this really specific and profound, for me, conversation. And we shall do our best to preserve it and make it available for anybody who might be interested in the future.
Thank you.